The California sun bathed the Salgado mansion, but the light could not dispel the shadow of melancholy that hung over the living room. Eduardo Salgado, a 48-year-old man with the vitality of a successful businessman, sat alone, hearing only the expensive ticking of an antique clock and the soft, monotonous sound of the television in his mother's room. He held the world in his hands, but felt like a stranger in his own home, a spectator in the life he had built. The Los Angeles mansion, with its immaculate gardens and ocean views, resembled a white marble mausoleum. The presence of Doña Carmen, his mother, now reduced to silent frailty in her wheelchair, was the center of this sadness. She was the portrait of contained pain, her once vibrant body paralyzed and dependent, a cruel irony of life for the woman who had always been the pillar of the family. Relief for Eduardo, or at least what I wanted, that there was relief. It came in the form of Camila Herrera Young. Beautiful and incredibly devoted, she was Doña Carmen's girlfriend, who became her essential caregiver. Her presence was a breath of youth and efficiency, solving all household problems and, most importantly, caring for his mother with almost saintly patience. The household routine was a silent choreography. The morning injection of medication, the meticulously prepared baby food, the long hours of passive physical therapy. Camila controlled everything with gentle firmness, dismissing the need for other nurses and insisting that Doña Carmen's stability depended on her sole care. Eduardo saw this dedication as the greatest gesture of love he could receive, an unexpected gift in his hectic life. Yet beneath the facade of tranquility and control lurked an insidious tension. The silence in the house wasn't one of peace, but of something contained, something stifled. Eduardo's conversations with his mother were one-sided, met only by guttural sounds and distant glances, and the joy he felt at seeing her improve was always tempered by the feeling that she was slowly fading away. The dinner table, once teeming with Latin joy, was now occupied by Eduardo and Camila, engaged in a superficial conversation about their day, while Carmen's shadow loomed over them. Eduardo missed the warmth of his homeland, his mother's laughter, the strength she radiated, and this void was filled only by his girlfriend's polite smile, which seemed perfectly adapted to this new silent drama. That night, before retiring, Eduardo went to his mother's room to kiss her goodnight. The room, the only room in the house that still smelled of lavender and hope, was dark, lit only by a reading lamp. Camila had already medicated her and was tucking her into bed, her slender figure like the shadowy guardian of a secret. As he approached, Eduardo took his mother's wrinkled hand, feeling the weakness in her bones. He told her he loved her in a broken whisper, and waited for the small squeeze that was the only sign of recognition she could give. But this time, there was no squeeze, only a desperate struggle in her eyes. The eyes of Doña Carmen widened slightly, focusing on Eduardo with an almost painful intensity. It wasn't the confusion of illness, it was a desperate plea, a cry for help. His lips trembled in a vain attempt to form a word, a silent warning that said, "Careful." But before he could react, Camila was there, with a calm smile and a reassuring touch on Carmen's shoulder, and the old woman's gaze broke, as if the warning had been cruelly silenced. The next morning began like all the others. A hurried coffee, urgent emails from New York, Eduardo's routine as a shield against the silence of the night. He tried to avert his gaze from his mother, convincing himself it was merely a reflection of the pain, a hallucination of his own guilt for leaving her in that state. He sank into his office, a refuge of dark wood and power, seeking in the organization of his work a peace that home could not provide. While reviewing financial reports, the door to his office opened with a nervous hesitation. It was Diego Ramirez, the cook's 8-year-old son, Maria. The boy, usually a burst of energy and laughter, was pale and trembling, his dark eyes fixed on Eduardo with a seriousness unbecoming of his age. He clutched a toy car protectively, as if it were a talisman. Eduardo, impatient with the interruption, but softened by the boy's fragility, asked him to speak. Diego hesitated, staring at the closed door, as if afraid the walls had ears. The tension in the air was palpable, a jarring contrast to the atmosphere of luxury and control Eduardo prized. Whatever it was, it frightened him deeply. Finally, in a barely audible whisper, the boy leaned across the table and blurted out the words, he had seen Camila. He had seen her in Doña Carmen's room, at a moment when she thought she was alone, crushing something white and small, a pill perhaps, and putting it in the vegetable soup that would later be served to the old woman. Eduardo's first reaction was fury and disbelief. It was absurd, a childish fantasy, the unconscious malice of a boy who didn't understand the adult world. He was about to reprimand Diego and send him back to his mother, accusing him of lying for fun. The idea that Camila, his devoted girlfriend, would hurt anyone was grotesque. However, as he stared into Diego's tearful eyes, his fury turned to a chill. The boy's fear was genuine, his narrative too specific to be fabricated, and his voice trembled with a conviction that surpassed the innocence of his age. Eduardo took a deep breath, trying to silence the voice of denial in his mind, the voice that shielded him from the most painful truth. He asked Diego why he thought Camila would do something like that. The boy shrugged, lacking an adult theory, but his answer was even more disturbing. He said Camila always got nervous when Doña Carmen tried to move her hand or foot, and that she would quickly distract her or comfort her with a touch that felt, in fact, like restraint. Eduardo tried to calm the boy, promising he would investigate, but his inner world was already crumbling. The conversation ended abruptly, with Diego running out of the office, relieved to have unburdened his secret, but still terrified of the potential consequences. He had warned him. Eduardo stood alone in the restored silence of the office, his head spinning with the implications of the accusation. His mother's warning look the night before, the boy's disturbing words, the forced tranquility of the house, all combined in a terrifying dissonance. He needed more than a child's word, but he couldn't ignore it. As Diego stood at the door, about to leave, he turned one last time and added with a sadness that echoed in Eduardo's heart, "She doesn't let her mom try to walk, ever. She doesn't let her mother try to walk, ever." This simple, direct sentence coming from an unarmed observer was the key that turned the lock on Eduardo's doubt, confirming that the silence in the house was, in fact, a carefully orchestrated prison. The hours after Diego's revelation were a slow torture for Eduardo. The corporate world on his computer lost all meaning, replaced by the urgency to observe his own home with fresh eyes. He felt like a spy, an intruder, and the guilt of doubting Camila, who had been so good to him and his mother, weighed like lead. Denial was a fortress, but the cracks were widening. He began spending more time in the common rooms, pretending to be immersed in his tablet, but with his peripheral vision completely focused on Camila. What had once seemed like dedication and affection now felt like absolute control. Her every gesture was calculated, the angle at which she adjusted the pillow, the way she held the glass to give Carmen water, the firmness of her hand on the back of the wheelchair. Eduardo noticed the subtlest of acts. Whenever Doña Carmen made a sound of effort or tried to move her foot on the chair's footrest, Camila acted immediately. She didn't scold her, but calmed her in a monotone voice, changing the focus of the conversation, or offering a snack. It was a shift of attention so quick and smooth that it would have gone unnoticed by anyone except her now alert son. Food was the central point of control. Camila insisted on preparing all her mother's meals herself, claiming that only she knew the exact proportions of prescribed vitamins and supplements. She was the filter between Doña Carmen and the world, ensuring that nothing entered the elderly woman's body without her approval, and, Eduardo now wondered, without her intervention. The memory of Doña Carmen before the paralysis came as a painful shock. He remembered his active mother, the woman who energetically oversaw the gardens, who laughed loudly and danced at parties. She was the force of life, the matriarch who traveled alone and inspired everyone around her. The image of her present figure, shrunken and silenced, contrasted terribly with the past. Eduardo's mind began to connect the dots he had previously ignored. His mother's deterioration was rapid, almost inexplicable to the doctors who visited her in the first few months. They spoke of disease progression, of atypical signs, but no one mentioned the possibility of something external, something malignant. He had accepted the diagnosis without questioning the only person who controlled her medication. A sharp pang of guilt struck him. How could he, the son, the experienced businessman, have been so blind? He'd focused on his own life and entrusted the most precious thing in his existence to a stranger he'd only known for a short time, seduced by her beauty and apparent kindness. The shadow of doubt wasn't just in Camilla, but in his own judgment. That afternoon, Eduardo watched her from afar as she tended to the medicine cabinet in Carmen's room. She seemed completely at ease, moving with the confidence of someone who knows her territory. He approached, pretending to look for a book, and saw Camilla close a drawer with a quick movement. What was she hiding there? The tension was almost unbearable. Eduardo felt his heart race as she turned to him with that perfect smile. He tried to sound normal, to ask a casual question, but his eyes were fixed on her hand, on the small movement she tried to hide as she moved away from the dresser. In the fleeting reflection of the light coming from the window, Eduardo saw a metallic glint in the palm of Camilla the moment she quickly hid it in the pocket of her caretaker's apron. It wasn't jewelry. It was the glint of a syringe or a small metal object. She thought she was alone, and that fleeting glimpse was the catalyst. Control gave way to paranoia, and doubt turned to certainty. That house was a stage, and his mother was the victim. The sight of the metallic glint on Camilla's hand was the point of no return. Eduardo could no longer pretend Diego's words were fantasy, or that his mother's gaze was merely a reflection of the disease. Denial was dead. Now, the urgent need was to act cautiously and seek the proof that would transform his suspicion into irrefutable evidence. He waited for night, the only time Camilla retired to her guest room, and the house fell into complete silence. With his heart pounding, Eduardo headed to what she called her therapy room, a room off the master bedroom that she had converted into her own, private domain. It was the only place in the mansion he wouldn't enter without being invited. The door was locked, as he'd expected. Eduardo, however, knew where the master key was for every door in the house, a small detail of his routine he never imagined he'd have to use this way. In a tense moment, he opened the door and entered the room with his cell phone's flashlight, sweeping the beam over the room. The room was strangely sterile and organized, unlike the rest of the house, which had a touch of homely comfort. On a bookshelf, Eduardo found what he was looking for: a collection of bottles without labels, empty containers, and measuring instruments. A subtly sweet chemical smell hung in the air, an odor he couldn't identify, but it immediately made him feel nauseous. He opened a cupboard and found several notebooks with dark covers, filled with Camilla's elegant handwriting. They weren't love diaries or reflections, but meticulous notes, dates, doses, the patient's reactions, and obscure medical terms. He saw the word relaxing and muscle noted several times, accompanied by graphs of her mother's deteriorating mobility. The shock was physical, paralyzing. In a lower drawer, hidden beneath bundles of cotton and gauze, he found a stack of crumpled invoices. They were not from pharmacies in Los Angeles, but from a drug supplier in Mexico, and, shockingly, from a veterinary clinic in Tijuana. What could his mother, a woman who barely left the house, have to do with a veterinary clinic on the border? The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in a horrifying way. With trembling hands, Eduardo searched the rest of the room, looking for anything he could take to prove the crime. He needed physical evidence before confronting Camilla, before alerting the authorities. The sight of his girlfriend, the woman sleeping beside him like a cold, calculating criminal, was almost unbearable. He managed to discreetly tear a page from one of the notebooks, the one detailing the most recent dosages and the goal of complete immobility. He also grabbed a small vial containing a suspicious white powder, placing both in a plastic bag he'd tucked into his jacket, leaving no visible trace of his intrusion. Eduardo hurriedly stuffed the bag into his inside jacket pocket, the material on his chest seeming to burn his skin with the toxicity of the truth. Just as he was about to close the door and return to his room, he knew he wasn't alone. A very subtle noise, a reflection in the corner of his eye, made him turn. He saw no one, but the icy sensation of being watched invaded him. Someone had been watching him through the crack in the door before he locked it, and now that person knew he had the evidence. The night was a vigil. Eduardo barely slept, the adrenaline of the discovery keeping him alert and nauseous. The small plastic bag in his jacket was the evidence of the nightmare, the material evidence that transformed Camilla from devoted girlfriend to potential murderer. He knew the next step was crucial. He needed professional validation for what he had found. He couldn't go to the local hospital, fearing that Camilla had connections or that the case would be treated negligently. He remembered the Dr. Valeria Mendez, a trusted geriatrician who had cared for Doña Carmen before her paralysis. A discreet, skeptical doctor, completely devoted to ethics. She was the one he needed. Eduardo called Valeria using a disposable phone number and requested an urgent and confidential visit. He used a vague excuse about his mother's worsening condition, but insisted that she not tell anyone on the household staff, especially Camilla, about his presence. Eduardo's voice was tense, and Valeria, sensing the urgency beneath the formality, agreed to come immediately. When Valeria arrived, she entered the mansion with a ray of cold professionalism. She examined Carmen with a meticulous attention that the nurses on duty would never have. She noted her pallor, her muscle tremors, her minimal response to stimuli, and most importantly, the way Camilla hovered in the doorway, anxious and tense, her smile forced. After the exam, Valeria called Eduardo to a corner of the library, away from Camilla's interference. Eduardo showed him the notebook page with the graphs and the vial of powder. Valeria's eyes, initially skeptical, widened in horror as she read the notes and analyzed the material. Valeria was direct, her voice a whisper of steel. Eduardo, this doesn't seem to be the natural progression of any disease I know of. Doña Carmen's symptoms, the lethargy, the progressive paralysis, they correspond to a slow and controlled intoxication. The word intoxication echoed in Eduardo's mind like a gunshot. The doctor explained that the charts and doses seemed to indicate the use of a paralyzing agent, likely a high-potency muscle relaxant, dosed to immobilize and silence, without killing immediately. The goal was to keep Carmen alive, but completely dependent. It was methodical, cold, and long-term cruelty. Valeria proposed the only solution. She would collect blood and urine samples for comprehensive laboratory tests, focusing on unconventional substances and toxins. She would do this covertly, as part of a routine checkup, so Camilla wouldn't suspect anything. The evidence needed to be scientific and incontrovertible to be presented to the police. As she prepared to leave, with Carmen's blood sample carefully tucked away in her briefcase, Valeria stopped and looked deeply at Eduardo. With a gravity Eduardo would never forget, she said in a low, almost lamenting voice, "Eduardo, if I'm right, Doña Carmen isn't sick. She's being made sick. And this is a premeditated crime. Eduardo, if I'm right, Doña Carmen isn't sick. They're making her sick. And that's already a premeditated crime." The coldness of this statement turned his personal suspicion into a criminal case involving his mother's life. With Dr. Valeria on her way to the lab and the test being analyzed, Eduardo's anxiety reached an unbearable peak. He was now in a race against time, feeling that with every passing hour, his mother was in danger. He needed to find more clues, something that would link Camilla to a criminal past and explain the diabolical motive behind her actions. He remembered the notes from the veterinary clinic in Tijuana and Camilla's obsession with keeping her mother secluded. There was a pattern, a story he hadn't seen before. He decided to search the house again. Not the therapy room, but the places where Camilla might have hidden something more about her identity. The library, a vast room with oak shelves and the smell of ancient paper, was an unlikely place for a secret, but Eduardo began leafing through the oldest, least used books. Amidst a collection of Mexican poetry that belonged to his mother, he felt something loose between the yellowed pages. It was an old photograph. Faded at the edges, Eduardo picked it up cautiously and saw the image that made him gasp. The photo showed a much younger Camilla, just as beautiful, but with a harder, bolder expression. She was smiling, a smile of triumphant satisfaction. Beside him stood two men. One, older, with an air of authority, wearing an expensive suit. The other, younger, with the appearance of a henchman. And beside them stood an elderly woman, equally weakened and paralyzed, sitting in a wheelchair identical to Carmen's. The setting appeared to be a luxury estate, perhaps in Mexico. The shock was overwhelming. It wasn't just the presence of the two men and the old woman. It was the Camilla's gesture. In the photo, she had her hand on the older woman's shoulder. But it wasn't a gesture of affection or support. It was a squeeze, a subtle demonstration of possession and dominion, the same control that Eduardo saw daily over his own mother. Eduardo realized the horror. His mother wasn't the first. Camilla was part of a scheme, a network of parasites that targeted wealthy, lonely, elderly people, slowly incapacitating them to take control of their lives and fortunes. The pattern was there, in black and white. The men were her accomplices, the logistics of the crime. He pocketed the photo, feeling the rough paper against his skin, evidence more powerful than any document. He stormed out of the library in a cold fury, transforming the pain of betrayal into determination for justice. He had to expose the network, not just get Camilla out of his house. As he passed the kitchen, he saw Camilla. She was on the phone, speaking with eerie calm, but her eyes narrowed slightly upon seeing Eduardo. She seemed to be sizing him up, like a predator sizing up its prey. Eduardo managed to hide the look of horror and anger he felt, but not completely. Camilla hung up the phone and smiled at him, asking if he was okay. In that instant, he realized she wasn't asking out of affection, but observation. She noticed something on his face. A subtle shift in his expression. He was sure. She knew he was investigating. The hunt had become mutual. From the moment he realized Camilla was suspicious of his investigation, Eduardo knew he couldn't act alone. He needed someone discreet, efficient, and above all, not connected to any official law enforcement agency that could be compromised by Camilla's network. He needed a shadow expert. Your contact was Martin Ruiz, a former security chief turned high-level private investigator with a somewhat murky past, but a network of contacts that stretched throughout Mexico and the United States. Martin was the man for the dirt, for the secrets the newspapers wouldn't publish. Eduardo arranged the meeting at a neutral location, a cafe in a neighborhood far from downtown Los Angeles, and handed Martin the crumpled photograph and the notes from the veterinary clinic. He narrated Diego's story, his mother's look, the discovery in the therapy room, all in a dry, matter-of-fact tone, containing his emotion so as not to appear blinded by jealousy. Martin, a man of few words and a penetrating gaze, studied the photo calmly. He examined the men, the elderly woman, the property's background, and Camilla's demeanor. He didn't ask questions about Eduardo's romantic involvement, focusing solely on the facts presented and the inconsistencies in the case. Martin's silence weighed more heavily than any accusation. He promised Eduardo that he would delve into the pasts of the two men in the photo, tracing their fortunes, their losses, and their connection to the woman in the wheelchair. He would use his contacts in immigration records, property files, and private databases that the police would never touch. The work would be fast, expensive, and above all, dangerous. Eduardo agreed to all the conditions regardless of the cost. His only priority was his mother's safety and the dismantling of the network. He felt as if he had transferred the weight of the world onto Martine's shoulders, a temporary relief, but knowing that the hardest part was yet to come. Martine was about to get up and leave, the photo tucked away in a folder, when he stopped. He looked directly at Eduardo, with a seriousness that bordered on menacing. Not at Eduardo, but at the danger he posed. Before leaving, Martin warned him in a low, serious voice. If she's in this, she's not alone. It's a network. If you confront her, you're confronting everyone. Stay vigilant, and most importantly, act as if nothing has changed. If she notices your haste, you'll lose her and put your mother in even greater danger. This warning that Camilla was just a pawn in the network cemented in Eduardo the understanding of the vast scale of the crime. The wait for the lab results was the longest of Eduardo's life. He maintained a facade of normalcy with almost unbearable exhaustion, chatting with Camilla about business and future plans while watching her every step, imagining her as a spider spinning its web. The thought of the poison being administered daily haunted him. 2 days later, Dr. Valeria Mendez scheduled another secret meeting. This time, she wasn't just grave, she was visibly distraught. Science had spoken, and what she revealed confirmed everyone's worst nightmare. Valeria handed Eduardo a technical report, full of graphs and specialized terms. She summarized the conclusion quietly but firmly. Doña Carmen's blood and urine samples contained high concentrations of a muscle relaxant for veterinary use, a potent sedative for large animals. The substance was being metabolized slowly, preventing locomotion without being immediately lethal. The doctor explained that the dosage was precise and methodical. It wasn't a medical error or an accident. The goal was to keep Carmen in a state of paralysis and semi-consciousness so that she would appear sick and dependent without arousing suspicion. The crime's longevity was what made it so cruel and calculated. Eduardo felt a mixture of blind fury and overwhelming guilt. His mother wasn't recovering because she was being actively poisoned in her own home. He, her son, had failed to protect her. Tears of rage came quickly, not from pain, but from indignity and outrage. Valeria, with a compassionate touch, reminded Eduardo that he acted at the right time and that the criminal was to blame. She emphasized that the evidence was irrefutable and, more importantly, legally admissible. The scientific report was the weapon he needed to bring down Camila. Eduardo felt a cold relief. The doubt had completely vanished, replaced by a burning desire for justice. He had the scientific proof, the confirmation that his girlfriend was, in fact, a criminal who was slowly poisoning his mother. Valeria handed over the results and looked Eduardo in the eye, reaffirming the seriousness of the situation. Her voice was a whisper, but her words were a sentence. Eduardo, this is already a crime. You are no longer a suspect. Your mother is the target of a prolonged attempted murder. We have to act fast. Now. The report wasn't just a diagnosis. It was confirmation that his life had become the scene of a terrible crime. With the scientific evidence in hand, Eduardo was ready for action. But Martine's prudence held him back. He needed to understand the full extent of the threat before striking. Exposing Camila without understanding the network could mean her disappearance and impunity for her accomplices. At the end of that day, Martin Ruiz scheduled a new meeting, with the air of someone who had discovered something big and dark. He arrived with a briefcase full of account statements, property records, and obituaries. What he had to say would make the old photos seem like just the tip of the iceberg. Martin confirmed the macabre pattern. The two men in the photograph, identified as a lawyer and a Mexican businessman, did indeed have elderly relatives who became disabled under suspicious circumstances. In both cases, the official cause of paralysis was degenerative disease, and in both cases, Camila Herrera was present as a dedicated caregiver at the time. The most shocking thing was the timeline. The elderly men's deterioration coincided with Camila's arrival, and control of their financial assets was quickly transferred to the men in the photo, who conveniently became their legal guardians. The modus operandi was the same: incapacitate them in order to steal, using the appearance of dedication. Martine also brought the call logs. There was intense communication between Camila's cell phone and encrypted numbers registered in different cities in Mexico City and Monterrey. The frequency and duration of the calls showed that she was not a lone wolf, but the field worker of a well-established organization with logistics and coordination. Eduardo felt a chill as he realized the pattern. His mother was just the latest project in this network of elderly exploitation. His indignation gave way to cold horror. Camila was a serial predator, and he had placed her at the heart of his family. The guilt over his blindness was almost unbearable. The network of contacts, according to Martine, appeared to involve corrupt doctors who supplied the muscle relaxants and lawyers who expedited the transfer of assets. It was a cold, high-profit, transnational operation with the ability to quickly cover its tracks. Martine looked at Eduardo, the gravity of his gaze conveying the seriousness of the threat. They couldn't go to the police with just the evidence of poisoning. They needed Camila caught red-handed to arrest the entire network at once and dismantle the organization. Martine closed the folder, and the dry sound of leather made a click in the tension of the air. He handed Eduardo a sheet of call logs and frequency analysis. The last highlighted line showed a series of recent calls with an unidentified number. "We need to know what they're planning now. Rushing can be fatal, but waiting gives them the chance to deliver the final blow. Prepare for the trap." The time to act had arrived. Eduardo, Valeria, and Martine met in a secret location far from the mansion to devise the plan that would unmask and arrest Camila. The strategy needed to be flawless, ensuring that evidence was collected at the time of the crime and that Doña Carmen's safety was the priority. The central idea was to create a scenario that would encourage Camila to accelerate her plan. Eduardo would simulate urgent business trip to New York, leaving the house in Camila's care and, theoretically, unsupervised. Her son's absence would make her feel safe enough to administer a higher dose and finish her work. Meanwhile, Martine, with the help of his team, would install high-definition micro-camera-sat strategic points in the mansion, in the kitchen, focused on the food preparation area, and in Doña Carmen's bedroom, with the audio activated. Visual evidence of the criminal act would be the final, irrefutable blow. Dr. Valeria would be the medical support figure on standby, monitoring Carmen's vital signs remotely and intervening immediately if the venom dosage was lethal. She would also ensure sample collection in loco if there was a case of poisoning. The risk was high, but the need for justice was greater. Diego Ramirez, the boy who dared to speak, would play a crucial role. He would become Eduardo's inner eyes and ears. Diego's mother would be sent on a day off, and the boy would stay home, pretending to be immersed in his video games and cartoons, but with the mission of observing Camila's movements and reporting any abnormalities to Martine, who would be undercover near the mansion. Eduardo set the plan in motion the next morning, acting with calculated calm. He gave Camila a goodbye hug, expressing his concern about leaving her alone with the responsibility of her mother. His performance was convincing, and Camila responded with a reassuring smile, promising to take care of everything. The moment Eduardo walked out the gates, Martine's team sprang into action, disguised as gardeners and maintenance technicians. The cameras were quickly installed, and communication with Valeria and Martine was established. The trap was set, and the bait was released. Hours later, as the team left and silence returned to the house, Camila answered a prepaid cell phone. Diego, pretending to play a game, heard her in a tense whisper. The sentence she said filled with terrifying coldness, confirmed that the trap would work. The final dose will be this weekend. He's gone. We'll make it look like rapid deterioration. The final dose will be this weekend. He's gone. We'll make it look like a rapid deterioration. Eduardo was in a discreet hotel just miles from his home, watching the live video feed from the micro cameras on a dark screen. Martin was beside him, wearing headphones, monitoring the audio and perimeter security. The tension in the room was palpable. Each second felt like an hour. The wait lasted until early evening. Kitchen cameras showed Camilla entering with fresh ingredients. She acted with the familiarity of her routine, preparing a smooth soup destined for Doña Carmen. With every movement, Eduardo felt a chill run down his spine. He was about to see the betrayal with his own eyes. The crucial moment came when Camilla made sure the day cook had left and Diego was in his room. She took a small dark bottle, identical to the one Eduardo had found. With a quick, practiced movement, she added a few drops of the clear liquid to the soup, stirring it with a spoon to ensure the poison was completely dissolved. The kitchen cameras left no doubt. Then she made a phone call, speaking softly but clearly captured by the microphone. Today's dose was complete. The adjustment will come soon. Yes, this weekend, as agreed. The sun is out. Today's dose was complete. The adjustment will come soon. Yes, at the weekend, as we agreed. The sun is out. It was the confession, the visual and audible proof of the crime. Eduardo felt a scream catch in his throat, anger overcoming him. Martin restrained him with a firm gesture, reminding him of the need to have the evidence in Carmen's room and confirmation that the soup would be eaten. They needed the final evidence for the police to act. Camilla carried the tray to Carmen's room. The camera in the room captured her with the bowl, feeding the elderly woman the poisoned soup with the same false patience Eduardo had admired before. Carmen swallowed with difficulty, her eyes watering with weakness, and Camilla smiled at her. Eduardo and Martin watched the recording in silent shock. The coldness and cruelty of the scene were indescribable. Camilla, after feeding the victim, returned to the kitchen, washed the bottle and put it in her apron pocket, with the same metallic sheen Eduardo had noticed days earlier. Martin turned off the monitor, his face hard and expressionless. He looked at Eduardo, who was pale and trembling, and said the only thing that mattered now: "We have enough to catch her. The police are on their way. Get ready to go home, Eduardo. The showdown is now." The betrayal was revealed, and now it was time for justice. The action plan was put into motion. Martin served the search and arrest warrant with the police, who were already on standby, and Eduardo drove back to the mansion at high speed, accompanied by Martin and an unmarked police car. Dr. Valeria was waiting outside, ready to enter and stabilize Doña Carmen. Eduardo entered the house quietly, with the police officers close behind. They found Camilla in the kitchen, wearing her caretaker's apron, holding a tray containing a dose of herbal tea for her mother. She seemed completely at ease, unaware that the trap had sprung. "Camilla?" Eduardo's voice was icy, more of an order than a greeting. She turned, and the smile on her lips froze at the hard expression on Eduardo's face, and even more so at the sight of the two police officers behind him, with their vests and serious expressions. The confrontation was brief. The officers instructed her to drop the tray and put her hands on her head. Camilla's shock quickly gave way to cold fury. She denied everything, screaming that Eduardo was being ungrateful and that the neighbors would see her treated like a criminal. One of the police officers approached and searched Camilla, finding in the inside pocket of her coat the dark bottle, still with residue of the paralyzing liquid. The evidence was physical and was on the criminal's body. The moment the vial was displayed was the height of tension. As Camilla was handcuffed, Dr. Valeria rushed to Carmen's room to administer the antidote and begin detoxification and stabilization procedures. Edward stood in the kitchen, watching the woman he loved being taken away. The pain of betrayal was unbearable. Camilla's last sight before leaving the house in custody was the most terrifying. She stood in the doorway, her body restrained by the police, and looked directly at Eduardo. His face, stripped of its mask of kindness, was pure hatred and contempt. Camilla smiled, a smile without warmth, and whispered, her voice so low that only Eduardo could hear amidst the chaos. "I'm not the only one. And by the time you find out, it'll be too late. You're weak. I'm not the only one. And when you find out, it will be too late. You are weak." The threat that there were other members of the Free Network made Eduardo's blood run cold, turning the victory into a grim warning. Camila Herrera's arrest was just the beginning. With the irrefutable evidence of the videos and the muscle relaxant, American and Mexican authorities, coordinated by Martin and the network's financial information, began a series of simultaneous arrests. Camila's warning that she was not alone proved to be true. The arrests took place in Los Angeles, where the lesser-ranking accomplices were detained, but the most impactful actions took place in Mexico. Mexico City and in Monterrey, the police arrested the two men in the photo, the lawyer and the businessman, and several others who were involved in the financial logistics and supply of illegal veterinary medicines. The case exploded in the media. Los Angeles newspapers and Mexican news channels covered the story of the Hollywood Angel of Death and the elderly exploitation ring. The scandal turned the case into an international topic, exposing the vulnerability of wealthy, lonely seniors. Investigations revealed that the network was sophisticated, with cells in several cities, targeting elderly people with large assets and absent heirs. Camilla was the model caregiver, the embodiment of dedication, whose job was to gain trust, isolate the victim, and administer the poison slowly, facilitating the legal seizure of assets by her accomplices. Eduardo, who initially tried to remain anonymous, was forced to come forward. He became the face of the fight against elder abuse, giving interviews about the importance of surveillance. His pain and fury, channeled into determination, resonated with the public. Authorities also confirmed the connection to the other elderly people in the photo and unrelated cases. The network had claimed several victims, and Camilla's arrest was the trigger for dismantling a criminal operation that had been active for years, moving millions of dollars and causing immense pain. The relief of justice was tempered by the knowledge that the network still had branches and that some members were still at large. The danger had not completely disappeared, but the center of the web had been cut. The news continued to roll on television, and one report in particular caught Eduardo's attention. An expert on organized crime in Mexico warned, "The mastermind behind this elderly exploitation ring has not been caught. Dr. Valeria is in danger. He or she may be closer than we think." The media alert confirmed Eduardo's fear that the threat had not been fully neutralized. With Camilla imprisoned and the truth exposed, the mansion began a slow and painful healing process. The silence, which had once been suffocating, was now one of relief and hope. Doña Carmen was transferred to a specialized clinic under the constant supervision of Dr. Valeria, who began treatment, detoxification, and an intense program of physiotherapy. The recovery was gradual but remarkable. Dr. Valeria explained that because the dosage was controlled to incapacitate rather than kill, Carmen's body had a chance to reverse the paralysis. She was free of the poison, and her body was beginning to respond, albeit slowly. The first signs of recovery were small miracles. A slight tremor in her hand, which soon turned into a firmer grip, the ability to follow Eduardo with her gaze, and the first tear that ran down her face, a tear of relief and gratitude, no longer of despair. Diego Ramirez, the boy who saved Carmen's life, became a constant companion. He visited her daily, reading to her, telling stories about his games and the garden. His presence brought gentle laughter to Carmen and renewed joy to Eduardo, who saw in the boy's innocence a counterpoint to the evil that invaded his home. Eduardo devoted every free moment to his mother's rehabilitation. He attended her physical therapy sessions, encouraging her with a devotion that had been missing in her busy life before the tragedy. He not only helped her heal physically but also her soul, restoring the trust that had been shattered. The Los Angeles mansion, after weeks, welcomed Doña Carmen back, no longer as a mute prisoner, but as a recovering patient. The house was cleansed and purified, and Camilla's therapy room was transformed into a room of light and hope. The most emotional moment came later that month, under the hot California sun. The physical therapist put her in a stroller special, and Carmen made the first effort to support herself. Her knees trembled, her lips curled in a grimace of effort, but she remained standing. Eduardo watched the scene in the garden, his heart racing. When Doña Carmen took her first slow steps with the walker, the sound of rubber rubbing against marble was a symphony of victory. She looked at him, and a smile, the first real smile in years, broke across her face. The promise of a new life was there, in his mother's first hesitant steps, Eduardo's redemption from his blindness. The legal climax of the story arrived months later in a Los Angeles courtroom. The trial of Camila Herrera and her accomplices was the center of media attention. The evidence was overwhelming: the poisoning videos, Dr. Valeria's forensic report, and the records of Martin's organized crime network. Diego Ramirez, though young, was called to testify. With the courage of a key witness, he told the story of what he saw, his voice choked with emotion, but his story was coherent and devastating. His testimony, coming from an innocent background, shattered Camila's defense. The sentencing was swift and severe. Camila Herrera was sentenced to 25 years in prison for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit organized crime. His accomplices in Mexico received similar sentences. Justice, though belated, was complete and served as a warning to other exploitative networks. Eduardo, who had transformed his life, began actively supporting foundations for the protection of the elderly, using his influence and wealth to fund investigations and awareness programs. He became an activist, channeling his past guilt into a life mission. The final scene took place in the mansion that had been freed from silence and evil. The late afternoon sun, a vibrant Los Angeles sunset, bathed the garden. Doña Carmen, still frail but strong, walked without a walker, using a cane for support under Eduardo's watchful eye. She walked slowly across the lawn, the scent of lavender and wet earth invading her senses, a freedom she had thought lost forever. She looked at her son, his eyes full of life and love, and took the last step into Eduardo's arms. The embrace was the culmination of months of pain and struggle, a silent forgiveness and the promise of a future. The sun set, and Eduardo looked to the horizon, where the darkness no longer frightened him. Eduardo held his mother close, the feel of her strong, living body in his arms the greatest victory. He looked out at the golden sunset and made a promise, not just to himself, but to the world. Never again will I allow silence to hide the truth. May vigilance be our weapon against evil and love our shield. Thank you for following this journey of pain and redemption. The story of Eduardo, Doña Carmen, and Diego is a powerful reminder that true strength lies not only in our struggles, but in our ability to see the truth, even when it's hidden in our own homes. Never neglect that small whisper of intuition, that strange look from someone you love. The courage of a simple boy and the determination of a son seeking justice proved that silence is not peace, but a breeding ground for evil. If you feel something isn't right, trust your gut. Act. Don't be silent. The truth will always find its way to the light. If you enjoyed this gripping narrative and want more stories with strong hooks and impactful endings, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a comment with your favorite part and tell us, what is the truth that you refuse to let silence hide in your life?